Are you ready? Are you pumped up? Because we're about to dive into the middle section of the U.S. President's list and talk about some interesting facts on each. Our first part covered the first 15 presidents, and if you haven't checked it out, we have a link in the description for you. Will these guys be more interesting than the first batch? I mean, I'm not sure that's even possible, but let's see how it goes.
Long before he became one of the greatest orators and statesmen in American history, Abraham Lincoln was known for something quite different on the Illinois frontier: wrestling. Tall, wiry, and unusually strong, Lincoln grew up doing hard physical labor, splitting logs, hauling wood, and working farm fields. That strength translated into formidable wrestling prowess, which became part of his early legend. In fact, as a young man in New Salem, Illinois, Lincoln was so respected for his wrestling skill that local toughs dared not challenge him. According to one story, Lincoln once defeated the leader of a local gang of bullies known as the Clary's Grove Boys. After throwing their champion to the ground, Lincoln earned their lasting respect and something close to a reputation for being unbeatable. Over the course of his informal wrestling career, he reportedly only lost one match out of 300. His wrestling style wasn't the modern sport we think of today. It was catch as catch can, often rough and ruleless. In fact, Lincoln was known to taunt his opponents mid-match and occasionally challenge entire crowds, shouting things like, "I'm the big buck of this lick. If any of you want to try it, come on and wet your horns." Wow, those words are brutal. He'd be right at home in a Call of Duty lobby. In recognition of this early chapter of his life, Lincoln was inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in 1992 as an outstanding American. Of course, Lincoln's real fight was yet to come, the fight to preserve the Union. But the same traits that made him a dominant wrestler, strength, endurance, and sheer determination, would serve him well as president during the nation's most perilous time. The rail splitter, the wrestler, the president. Abraham Lincoln's legacy rests not only on what he said and signed, but also on the character forged in the ring long before he entered the White House. When Andrew Johnson took the oath of office as Vice President on March 4, 1865, he did so in a condition most historians politely describe as visibly intoxicated. The truth may be even more embarrassing. Johnson was so drunk that day, he slurred his words, rambled incoherently, and had to be physically restrained. Johnson had reportedly been battling typhoid fever, and to treat it, or perhaps calm his nerves, he drank whiskey before the ceremony. Unfortunately, it wasn't just a sip. During his inaugural address in the Senate chamber, he ranted for so long that the outgoing vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, tried to cut him off. Johnson then tried to swear in new senators, a ceremonial role of the vice president, but fumbled and confused their names. Newspapers were scandalized. The New York Times called it a national disgrace. Lincoln, always diplomatic, is said to have brushed it off, but many in Washington were horrified that this was the man a heartbeat away from the presidency. Just 6 weeks later, Lincoln was assassinated, and that heartbeat stopped. Johnson suddenly became the 17th President of the United States, thrust into office at a moment of national trauma. His presidency, unfortunately, was not much more successful than his debut. A Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War, Johnson clashed with Republicans in Congress over how to rebuild the South. He opposed civil rights legislation, vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and resisted protections for newly freed slaves.
Congress overrode his vetoes and eventually impeached him. Johnson narrowly avoided removal from office by a single Senate vote, becoming the first U.S. president to be impeached. From his drunken start to his defiant finish, Andrew Johnson's presidency was a turbulent chapter in Reconstruction, a story of missed opportunities, bitter feuds, and a man out of step with his moment. Ulysses S. Grant led Union forces to victory in the Civil War and became a national hero. But once he moved into the White House, he had trouble slowing down, literally. Grant holds the unusual distinction of being the only U.S. president ever arrested for speeding, with a horse-drawn carriage. The incident took place in Washington, D.C., during his presidency in the early 1870s. Grant, known for his love of horses and a bit of a thrill-seeker behind the reins, had already been warned several times by police for galloping his carriage too fast through city streets. But one day, he pushed it too far. Officer William H. West, a black Union Army veteran working for the Metropolitan Police, pulled Grant over and, incredibly, placed the sitting president under arrest. According to West's own recollections, Grant was polite, even apologetic. He reportedly said, "I was not aware that I was going that fast," and did not attempt to use his power or position to avoid consequences. West let him go with a $20 fine, the equivalent of several $100s today. Grant's arrest became a legendary anecdote, a rare moment when a U.S. president literally ran afoul of the law in broad daylight. It also speaks to Grant's character. He accepted the penalty without protest, setting an example of equality under the law, even if unintentionally. Beyond this episode, Grant's presidency was a mix of heroic civil rights efforts, such as enforcing Reconstruction and crushing the Ku Klux Klan, and scandal, thanks to corrupt officials around him. But this speeding ticket reminds us that Grant, the general who won a war, also had a very human need for speed, even if it meant getting pulled over in the nation's capital. I mean, at least he didn't trample an elderly woman. Looking at you, Pierce. In an age when telegraphs still dominated long-distance communication, Rutherford B. Hayes embraced something radically new: the telephone. In 1877, just a year after Alexander Graham Bell patented the invention, Hayes had one installed in the White House, making him the first president to use a telephone. The line connected the White House to the Department of the Treasury, just a few blocks away. It was more of a curiosity than a useful tool at the time. There weren't many other phones to call, and sound quality was inconsistent. The phone's number was simply 1. Hayes was reportedly fascinated by the device, but also somewhat puzzled. After his first demonstration, he supposedly remarked to Bell, "That's an amazing invention, but who would ever want to use one of them?" The quote may be apocryphal, but it underscores how revolutionary and bewildering the telephone seemed in the 1870s. Hayes's interest in innovation didn't stop there. He also supported modernizing the civil service and issued one of the first calls for reform to end the spoils system, though major changes wouldn't come until after his term. His presidency began under a cloud of controversy. He was awarded the office after a disputed election that was settled by a special commission, despite losing the popular vote. Can you imagine having a president lead a country without winning the popular vote? Good thing we don't have to deal with that. Now I can't even get through that joke. Who writes this shit? The resulting compromise effectively ended Reconstruction, pulling federal troops out of the South, a decision with long-term consequences for civil rights. Yet, Hayes left office with his integrity intact. He refused to run for a second term, keeping a campaign promise that he would serve only one. Whether remembered for ushering in the end of Reconstruction or installing the first presidential phone line, Hayes helped connect a post-war nation to the technological and political future.
Before he became the 20th President of the United States, James A. Garfield was considered one of the most intellectually gifted leaders in American history. A former professor and college president, he was fluent in multiple classical languages and was reportedly able to write in Latin with one hand and Greek with the other simultaneously. Though the story is likely exaggerated, or at least never proven, it speaks to Garfield's reputation as a scholar. Born in a log cabin in Ohio and raised in poverty, Garfield was largely self-taught. He worked as a janitor to pay his way through college, then became a professor, and within a year was made president of Hiram College in Ohio at age 26. Garfield entered politics during the Civil War, rising to the rank of Major General in the Union Army before serving 9 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. He wasn't even seeking the presidency in 1880. He attended the Republican National Convention to nominate another candidate. But after a long deadlock, Garfield emerged as a compromise nominee and won the presidency in one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Tragically, Garfield would serve only 199 days as president. On July 2, 1881, he was shot by a disgruntled office seeker named Charles Guiteau at a Washington, D.C. train station. Garfield didn't die immediately. He lingered for 11 weeks, during which doctors probed his wound with unwashed hands and instruments, likely causing a fatal infection. Many historians believe it was medical malpractice, not the bullet, that killed him. He died on September 19, 1881, and his passing spurred a national outcry for reform, leading directly to the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which began dismantling the corrupt spoils system. James A. Garfield's presidency was tragically short, but his legacy endures as a man of rare intellect, integrity, and unfulfilled promise. When Chester A. Arthur became president in 1881, few expected much from him, and that was putting it mildly. Known as a political fixer and machine insider, Arthur was widely viewed as a symbol of corruption and patronage. As collector of the Port of New York, he had overseen one of the most lucrative and patronage-ridden federal jobs in the country. Critics joked that he was more likely to reorganize his wardrobe than reform the government. And about that wardrobe, Arthur was a famous dandy. He reportedly owned over 80 pairs of pants, which he changed several times a day. He favored silk shirts, fine suits, and polished footwear. And he hired a valet to help manage his outfits. Some called him Elegant Arthur. He even redecorated the White House with the help of famed designer Louis Comfort Tiffany, installing stained glass and high-end furniture. But Arthur would surprise everyone. After ascending to the presidency following the death of James A. Garfield, Arthur underwent what some historians call a transformation of character. He embraced civil service reform, the very thing his political allies despised. And in 1883, he signed the Pendleton Civil Service Act into law. This landmark legislation began dismantling the spoils system, requiring federal jobs to be awarded based on merit, not political loyalty. I'm assuming that law must no longer be in effect.
Anyway, Arthur also vetoed pork barrel spending, modernized the Navy, and stood firm against nativist immigration restrictions, even when they were popular. Though he never entirely shed his image as a fashionable insider, Arthur earned genuine respect by rising above the expectations set by his past. He served just one term and did not seek re-election, partly due to declining health. He was secretly suffering from Bright's disease, a fatal kidney ailment he kept hidden from the public. Today, Chester A. Arthur is often remembered less for his policies than for his style, but his presidency stands as a surprising lesson in reform, dignity, and second chances.
Grover Cleveland used to hold the distinction of being the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. But Donald Trump broke that record, among other things. So here's another story about him. In the summer of 1893, President Grover Cleveland vanished from public view. The country was in the grips of a severe economic depression known as the Panic of 1893, and Cleveland, just months into his second term, faced mounting political pressure. What the American people didn't know was that the president had also been diagnosed with cancer of the mouth. To avoid a national panic, Cleveland orchestrated a highly secretive surgery aboard a private yacht, the Oneida, as it sailed off Long Island. Disguised as a fishing trip, the operation was performed in the yacht's saloon by a team of 6 doctors. They removed a portion of Cleveland's upper jaw and 5 teeth, using ether as anesthesia, all while the vessel gently rocked in the Atlantic. The secrecy was intense. The surgical team was sworn to silence. Newspapers were told that Cleveland had simply had 2 bad teeth extracted. The full truth didn't emerge until 1917, nearly a decade after his death, when one of the surgeons published an article confirming the story. Even more remarkably, the surgery was a success. Cleveland had a prosthetic jaw fitted, adjusted his speech slightly, and returned to work without the public ever realizing what had happened. His calm demeanor and apparent good health reassured the markets, just as he intended. Grover Cleveland may be remembered as a tough, no-nonsense leader, but this episode revealed a different quality: strategic secrecy in the face of personal crisis, carried out not for vanity, but to preserve national stability during a precarious moment. When Benjamin Harrison moved into the White House in 1889, he and his family became the first presidential residents to have electric lights installed, a cutting-edge innovation at the time. But rather than embracing this new technology, the Harrisons were terrified of it. Electric lighting had only recently become available to the public, and it wasn't yet considered entirely safe. Accidents were common, and rumors of deadly shocks from faulty wiring circulated widely. As a result, neither President Harrison nor his wife Caroline would touch the light switches. They feared they might be electrocuted, and instead relied on White House staff to operate the lights for them. Despite his fear of electricity, Harrison's presidency was marked by modernization and expansion. He oversaw a period of technological advancement, including the development of the U.S. Navy, the admission of 6 new states, more than any other president since George Washington, and a forward-looking economic policy. He also signed the Sherman Antitrust Act into law, the first federal legislation aimed at curbing monopolies and corporate power, laying the groundwork for future trust-busting presidents like Theodore Roosevelt. Still, Harrison was often perceived as cold and aloof, earning the nickname the human iceberg. That reputation may have cost him a second term. He lost the 1892 election to Grover Cleveland,
the very man he had defeated 4 years earlier. But for all his contributions, it's the image of a sitting president refusing to touch the walls of his own house for fear of being shocked that has become one of Benjamin Harrison's most human and oddly charming legacies. Grover Cleveland technically comes next, but since we already talked about him, let's move on to our 25th president, William McKinley. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley was attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. As he stood in a receiving line, greeting a long procession of well-wishers, he did something he had done countless times before. He removed the red carnation from his lapel and handed it to a young girl standing nearby. That carnation wasn't just a flower, it was McKinley's good luck charm. He wore one almost every day of his adult life, especially during public appearances. But when the girl smiled at him, McKinley gently gave her the blossom and said, "I must give this flower to another little flower." Seconds later, the next person in line, an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz, who had concealed a pistol beneath a handkerchief, shot the president twice at point-blank range. McKinley initially survived the shooting. Surgeons at the exposition attempted to locate the bullet, but failed. And while he seemed to be recovering, he died of gangrene 8 days later, on September 14, 1901. The story of the flower has since become a haunting historical anecdote, a small, kind gesture that possibly coincided with the loss of McKinley's trademark protection. Whether superstition or coincidence, it adds a tragic, poetic note to his assassination. McKinley's presidency had been one of economic growth, territorial expansion, and increasing American power on the world stage. Under his leadership, the U.S. won the Spanish-American War, annexed Hawaii, and gained control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, actions that marked America's emergence as an imperial power. But his calm, grandfatherly demeanor and acts of gentleness, like giving a flower to a child, remind us that behind the high politics and global consequences was a man who simply wanted to share a moment of beauty. Theodore Roosevelt was already known for his physical vigor and rough-riding spirit long before he entered the White House, but even during his presidency, he refused to give up the kinds of adventures that most men half his age would have avoided, including boxing. Roosevelt regularly sparred with military aides, young officers, and even his own sons. He believed that staying physically active was key to staying sharp, and he maintained a strict regimen of exercise, hunting, hiking, and combat sports. But one day, during a White House sparring session with a young Army artillery officer, Roosevelt took a punch, and it blinded him in his left eye. He didn't tell the public. He didn't even tell many of his friends. Instead, Roosevelt kept it quiet, fearing it would be seen as weakness. For the rest of his life, he quietly concealed his blindness in that eye, compensating with extraordinary energy and a relentless, forward-charging demeanor. And that wasn't the only time Roosevelt risked life and limb. In 1912, long after his presidency, while running for a third term as a Progressive Party Bull Moose candidate, he was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin. The bullet passed through a steel glasses case and a folded speech in his breast pocket before lodging in his rib. Bleeding and winded, Roosevelt refused medical attention and went on to deliver a 90-minute speech, beginning with the line, "It takes more than one bullet to kill a bull moose." This was who Roosevelt was, an intellectual who read a book a day and a brawler who tested himself against the limits of body and will. He transformed the presidency with regulatory reforms, conservation efforts, and a belief in America's power abroad. But at the heart of it all was a man who, even after going half blind, never stopped throwing punches.
William Howard Taft is often remembered less for his policies than for one enduring, oversized tale: that he once got stuck in a White House bathtub. While the story has been exaggerated over the years, it has a basis in truth. Taft was a big man, weighing over 300 pounds during his presidency, 1909 to 1913, and his size required some accommodations. After an uncomfortable incident, reportedly during a stay at a hotel, though some versions place it in the White House, a custom-built bathtub was ordered for the executive mansion. The new tub was massive, large enough to hold 4 grown men comfortably. In fact, a famous photo exists of 4 workmen sitting inside the tub after its installation, proudly demonstrating its scale. That tub became part of White House lore and solidified Taft's image as the most physically imposing president. But there was far more to Taft than bathtubs. An accomplished jurist and administrator, Taft never truly enjoyed the presidency. He preferred the law, and once said he would rather be Chief Justice of the United States than president. He eventually got his wish. In 1921, Taft became the only person in American history to serve as both president and Chief Justice, a role he cherished until his death in 1930. During his presidency, Taft was a staunch trust buster, filing more antitrust lawsuits than even Theodore Roosevelt. He also helped establish the U.S. Postal Savings System and expanded the civil service. Taft's legacy is often overshadowed by Roosevelt's, especially after the two men split politically in 1912, leading to the dramatic three-way election that handed the presidency to Woodrow Wilson. Still, Taft remains a unique figure, a president who never really wanted the job, but who left his mark on both the executive and judicial branches, and who required the biggest bathtub in White House history to do it. In 1915, Woodrow Wilson made history not on the battlefield or in Congress, but in the East Room of the White House, where he hosted the first ever film screening for a sitting U.S. president. The movie? D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. It wasn't just any film. The Birth of a Nation was a technical marvel of early cinema, the first major full-length feature film in American history. But it was also blatantly racist, glorifying the Ku Klux Klan and portraying African Americans, many played by white actors in blackface, as violent and corrupt. Wilson, a former professor and historian, had known the film's source material and its author, Thomas Dixon, from his academic days. When Dixon arranged the screening, Wilson reportedly watched attentively. Afterward, he is alleged to have said, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." That quote remains controversial. Some scholars doubt he actually said it, and the White House later distanced itself from the film. But what's undeniable is that Wilson's hosting of the screening gave the film a huge publicity boost, helping it become a massive commercial success and contributing to a nationwide resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. The incident reveals the complexities and contradictions of Wilson's legacy. As president, Wilson oversaw progressive reforms, created the Federal Reserve, and led the U.S. through World War I. He also championed the League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations. But domestically, Wilson's record on race was deeply problematic. He resegregated federal offices, praised the Confederacy, and showed little concern for black civil rights, a stark contrast to the progressive image he cultivated in other areas. So while Wilson helped shape the modern presidency and international diplomacy, his decision to screen The Birth of a Nation and the shadow it cast remains one of the earliest and most troubling examples of how pop culture and presidential power can collide.
Warren G. Harding loved poker. In fact, he hosted twice-weekly games at the White House, often with cabinet members, senators, and journalists. The drinks flowed freely, despite prohibition. Cigars burned long into the night, and serious money, and sometimes valuables, exchanged hands. One night, the stakes got a little too high. According to multiple accounts, Harding once bet and lost an entire set of White House china during a poker game. Whether it was a personal set or government property remains unclear, but the image of the president casually gambling away porcelain dishes is both absurd and strangely fitting for Harding's style. A former newspaper publisher from Ohio, Harding ran on a promise of a return to normalcy after World War I. Charismatic and handsome, he looked the part of a president, but his administration quickly became infamous for its corruption and cronyism. Harding surrounded himself with what became known as the Ohio Gang, a group of friends and allies who exploited their positions for personal gain. The most infamous scandal to emerge was the Teapot Dome affair, in which Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, was caught leasing federal oil reserves in exchange for bribes, a scandal that shook public trust in government and led to Fall becoming the first U.S. cabinet member convicted of a felony. Harding himself was never directly implicated in these crimes, but he was criticized for poor judgment and lack of oversight. He reportedly said shortly before his death, "I have no trouble with my enemies, but my damn friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor at night." In 1923, while on a cross-country tour of the U.S., Harding died suddenly of a heart attack in San Francisco. Rumors swirled about poison, stress, and scandal, but no autopsy was ever performed. Though often ranked near the bottom of presidential lists, Harding's story reminds us that style without substance and high-stakes games in every sense can define a presidency. Calvin Coolidge, nicknamed Silent Cal, was known for his terse speech and understated style. He once famously responded to a dinner guest who said she had a bet that she could get him to say more than 2 words. "You lose." But behind the stoic public image was a man with a few unexpected quirks, including a love for gadgets. Perhaps the most unusual? He installed an electric mechanical horse in the White House for exercise. The device was essentially a motorized saddle that mimicked the motion of horseback riding. Coolidge, who disliked traditional workouts and thought walking was overrated, used it daily, bouncing in place for fitness and stress relief. He reportedly found the rhythm relaxing and claimed it helped keep his weight down. Coolidge also installed a mechanical bull, used an electric foot massager, and owned multiple gadgets that would feel right at home in a modern wellness routine. These habits reflected his belief in routine, order, and a form of self-care that was ahead of its time. His presidency reflected his personality, restrained, business-friendly, and quiet. He believed deeply in limited government, famously stating, "The business of America is business." Under his watch, the country experienced a booming economy and rapid technological growth, the height of the Roaring '20s. Yet, Coolidge resisted the urge to do too much. He vetoed farm relief bills, cut taxes, and slashed federal spending. His minimalist approach won praise at the time, though critics later argued it helped enable the conditions that led to the Great Depression. Still, Coolidge remains a singular figure, a man of minimal words but maximum peculiar charm, who bounced in place on a fake horse while leading the most powerful nation on earth. Last on the list today is our 31st president, Herbert Hoover. Long before he entered the White House, and long before the Great Depression tarnished his name, Herbert Hoover lived an adventurous life abroad, One of the most remarkable chapters? He and his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, were fluent in Mandarin Chinese and would often speak it in the White House to keep their conversations private. The Hoovers learned Chinese while living in Tianjin, China in the early 1900s. At the time, Hoover was a young mining engineer working for an international firm. Lou Henry, also a geologist and linguist, the first woman to graduate from Stanford with a geology degree, learned the language alongside her husband. When they moved into the White House decades later, they continued to use Mandarin as their secret language, often while walking the halls or when they didn't want staff or visitors to overhear. It made them one of the most linguistically gifted presidential couples in U.S. history. Hoover's intellectual credentials were vast. He was a self-made millionaire, a humanitarian who led massive international relief efforts during World War I, and a former Secretary of Commerce. His reputation as a brilliant organizer and problem solver helped him win the presidency in 1928 by a landslide. But just months into his term, the stock market crashed in 1929, ushering in the Great Depression. Hoover's response, grounded in voluntarism and limited government, was seen as too cautious and too slow. Shanty towns that sprang up across the country were mockingly called Hoovervilles, and his popularity plummeted. Despite the economic collapse, Hoover remained committed to public service. After leaving office, he helped lead post-war hunger relief and headed a government reorganization commission under President Truman. But behind the image of the embattled president was a deeply curious, globally minded man, one who could discuss Chinese mining law in Mandarin and debate economic theory in English, often within the same day. And that's it. 15 more down. Whew. Now keep in mind, these guys have other interesting stories and facts about them, and like the first list, there's definitely things we have missed. So that's where you come in. Share your favorite stories about these guys. Or don't. I mean, it's not like I can control your moves. You have free will. Use it. Man, live. Man, live. And while you're living, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because that's what any person with free will would do. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next week.